All right. All right, everybody. What's up, everybody? This is Marshall Couture, also known as Plex in Hip Hop Circles of the Escape Artist Podcast and DonkeyJawProjects.com. And today we have a special guest, Mr. Joshua Kemble. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. How's it going, Marshall?
Pretty good. Um, I guess yeah, we'll just do like the thing that everybody does is, let everybody know where they can find you before we talk and stuff and what you're all about.
Got it. Okay, so you can find my graphic novel at quarterlystories.com, and then I do the YouTubes. I do a channel where I, discuss like the process of creating that graphic novel on top of being a full-time art director. And so you can check out that channel just by looking for Joshua Kemble. And also my YouTube username, as I found out recently, is Polly Nothing. So yeah, so that's it.
Polly Nothing.
Yeah, it's a lot of nothing, and it's a little like username that I've been using forever. So like a lot of what I did for Threadless back in the day and stuff is under Poly Nothing as well. So yeah.
Ah, I see. Interesting. So yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, I would just say to everybody, I definitely recommend going and checking out Quarterly Stories. Really interesting autobio book. As he says, it's about faith and depression, and the things that he went through. And it's really good. It's amazing illustration work. And it's kind of what how many pages are you at now? I think
I'm
it's
on page 46, but the end game before it hits print is going to be 96.
90.
So
Oh wow, so you're about halfway. That's
yeah, and
pretty
then
cool.
once I get to 96, I'm going to release it as like a three floppy issue, so three 32-page comics, and those will be hopefully available for sale. But it's probably about a year to a year and a half away. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a comic I hand write, hand letter, and hand ink.
Hmm.
And I've been saying this on my vlog, even though it's corny, because it just kind of caught. So, and hand to you.
Oh, I love
Um,
it. I love it. Every time I wait for it and I'm like, yes.
nice. But yeah, I mean, it's also kind of a love letter to comics because I just sincerely love hand done art, and
Mm,
so I'm trying to kind of handcraft everything I possibly can, and check it out. I think you guys might enjoy it, and I think you summarized the what it's about and stuff pretty
yeah.
well. So
A little
yeah.
more awkward than you do usually, but still, it worked.
No, it was clean. That was a good pitch.
Um, so, and also you do like these kind of in between things when at times that are really cool too. Can you tell us a little bit about that with the comic?
Yeah, so the comics, I guess I gotta explain the comic a little bit. So the comic is black and white, kind of in the traditions of like old indie comics and underground comics you would find in Raw, or like if you're familiar with like Harvey Picar's stuff, or like R. Crumb, um, or like Art Spiegelman. By no means am I claiming it's as good. I mean, I it would be cool if it was, but it's kind of in the realm of that, where it's a black and white book, and I chose black and white pretty consciously because I think that at the end, when it's in print, it's really going to show off a lot of the like I use a lot of brushwork, and
Mhm.
so I really want the ink and the black and white to kind of stand out. But on top of that, like when there's a lag of time, occasionally I'll put in a filler strip, which in webcomic speak is just kind of like it's not part of the main story arc. It's these little filler strips, and they're referencing a character that's within the quarterly storyline, because it's going to be jumping back and forth from like childhood, which is going to be done in kind of a very cartoony, kind of silly retro style. And then jumping from that to the present, which is going to be done in a more hardline, very realistic, very rendered way. And
Mm.
so I take the kind of, there's a cartoon version of the character, and those are used for the filler strips. And the filler strips will be everything from little 3-panel, Sunday comic style strips, and I've been executing those in kind of a wacky pack kind of style. I don't know if you remember. Do you
Yeah.
remember those like wacky packs, Marshall?
I don't actually remember them, but I have come upon them
Yeah.
recently, and I think they're very cool and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so they used to be like these little cards that were all parody art. This is
Hmm.
explaining for the audience because Marshall's familiar with them, but they kind of like would package all these little trading cards, often with a stick of bubble gum, and then they'd be wrapped in wax paper, and then they would screen print on the wax paper. And one of the things that happened because of the lovely process of printing, and they were really cheaply printed, was they'd be kind of offset a little bit, and then they'd have really like their line screen that they would use to print the color would show these little halftones and stuff, and often they'd use these really bold colors. And so there's a certain look that I like to call the wacky pack look. I don't think I'm alone on that. Like, there's a lot of artists that were really influenced by that, which it's kind of cool because the more you look into it, the more you start realizing like a lot of cartoonists were involved in wacky packs, and like the Mars Attacks cards,
Yeah.
and like even like the Garbage Pail Kids and stuff. Like Art Spiegelman was directly involved in a lot of those things. So it's kind of, it always runs full circle in this tight little thing called comics. But I'm trying to do those in those styles, and then I also just recently completed one that's like an alphabet chart,
Yeah, that's really
influenced by
cool.
like vintage alphabet. So yeah, you guys can check that out at quarterlystories.com. But those are more a little fresh air and breathing room because it's a pretty heavy story. So it's fun to have some kind of silly fill-in strips and stuff. And even the filler strips kind of advance the story, I like to think, but we'll see.
Right, right. Yeah, and it kind of actually reminds me a little bit of like the Bazooka Joe things you get too,
Mm-hmm.
with the bubble gum and stuff. Two things I want to hit on with those actually, the those smaller ones is the like, well, basically because you mentioned the alphabet, I want to ask you what kind of got you. Well, first, I want to ask you, do you think you're going to print those? And then second, I want to ask you like about your fascination with hand lettering and stuff. Where did that all come from?
Awesome. Those are two really awesome questions that I'm really wordy, so I hope I don't go too long on them.
No, go ahead.
But I have a love of typography, and that didn't always start as a love of typography. Like, I think the love for it was there, but the love of researching and doing it is really, like, I guess in my lifetime, like a more recent development. And I think that development tends to happen with artists as they get more into design.
Hmm.
But I'll get into that in a little bit. The alphabet chart. So the idea behind it originated from some really interesting like kind of history and printing. So
Hmm.
printers back in the day used to do like a test sheet of some sort, and it was usually functioned as like a promotional material for the printer itself. And
Hmm.
so one thing that printers used to do as their kind of promotional that they would send out to possible clients and hang in their office and stuff like that, and also sell for a little bit of a profit, is alphabet charts, because the alphabet chart would usually be really immaculately illustrated, not too immaculately, but for the printing process at the time, they would use like their nicest printing, but it was usually minimal color, because while they wanted to show off, the beauty of their color and the way they're mainly wanting to show color registration, right?
Hmm.
And visual impact so that it can kind of lure the client into printing with them. But one of the things that they would do is kind of show off their ability to print readable type, print full color illustrations, but they also did it on a budget, so it was usually limited to like 4 or 5 colors. so that they'd only have like 4 or 5 plates to run, because offsets run in plates. So so this kind of became like almost like the vinyl record of like the Victorian era. Like, you know, like in the 70s, that was the sexy gig to get as an illustrator, was like you get like an LP and you got this big canvas to work on, you know, and you knew it would be distributed. So you really wanted to like, that was where you wanted to put your guns with your talent. And back in the day, if the printer was doing a promotional thing, a lot of the times you could run with it. So they would just literally say, make an alphabet chart at this size, and it was usually relatively large. So you got this large canvas, you know it's going to get printed, and you have more creative freedom on it. So a lot of really cool art is on these old alphabet charts. I mean, just if you're ever bored, look up vintage alphabet charts, and you'll see the weirdest. Some of them are really creepy because they're catering to children, but they have these really kind of dark like illustrations on them. Yeah. And then some of them are just, I mean, they're visually beautiful. So so that influenced me, and so I did mine as like a little bit of an homage to that. Totally long-winded way of saying it. I just like the alphabet. Another influence was like, I've got a toddler and he's just been like alphabet obsessed. Like, it's funny how like when kids first start learning numbers and alphabets, they get really excited about it. Like, and it kind of made me excited about it again, where I was like, yeah, the alphabet is cool. I'm going to do a poster on it.
That's awesome.
So yeah, that's your first question. And then the second is, I really love hand-done typography, and that's not always been the case. So when I first got into art school, I was an illustration major, and I loved type, but I always felt uncomfortable with type because I had focused so much on images like my entire college life, and just prior to that, like I didn't draw letters as often as I would draw people. And I remember in my first type class, you know, learning some really interesting things, but still feeling like, you know, tracking and kerning and all of this stuff, it's too much, you know? And I realized in retrospect that I feel like it was a failure on my part to creatively approach type, but it was also, I do feel like there's a certain way to gear education regarding typography that speaks to illustrators a little more than designers, because I think they're gearing most of that discussion to just specific designers. So really, for me, what happened was just starting to, like my first comic, I had my friend letter because I was so uncomfortable with lettering. And the more I did comics, the more it just becomes like when you do indie comics, one of the beauties of indie comics that I love is like the artist does everything, you know? And for me, I just wanted to overcome that hurdle for a pure utilitarian reason, which is just like, I want to be able to do everything on my comic, because that's one of the beauties of comics. Like, you don't need a team to make a story, and that's actually really unusual, you know? There's like pretty much 2 forms of art that allow that, you know, which is like, one is just the written word, and then the other is comics, and kind of animation, but to do a full-length movie animation, pretty much need a team. So like I wanted to be able to do that element, and I was weak at it. And one of the things that makes you grow as an artist is like, if you see a weakness, like that's what you should attack. So like, you suck at drawing feet, draw 5 panels with feet. You know, like, you suck at drawing from this angle, attack that angle, like work it into your story, because you'll grow, you know? You aren't good at 3/4 perspectives of buildings, do a couple city shots of 3/4 perspective of buildings, you'll figure it out, you know? Because when you draw it and it doesn't look right, you're going to see it. And then you kind of ask around and tackle it until you accomplish it, and then you have that in your tool belt. So the problem I was having with type, my main problem, was that I wasn't approaching it like I approached illustration. So once I started kind of tackling it from that angle, like, how do I draw letters? Like, what have people said in the past about drawing letters? Like, you know, and observing letter forms, like, so starting to like just a basic typeface like Helvetica, like looking at it and going like, okay, if I observationally had to draw this and break it down just like I would drawing a person, you know, you're not going to just draw a person. You're looking at the shapes, right, within a person and the center line and
Right.
breaking it down into these things. Once you start approaching type that way, it just abolishes the fear of type, because type, it has anatomy to it, just like people. And so like by looking at the anatomy of type, then it starts to make sense of what, you know, kerning is, what like your center line is, what, you know, your cap height is, like all of those things, tracking, all of that. Like it starts to make sense when you start approaching it from like an anatomical kind of perspective, like a drawing perspective. So that helped a lot. And then just doing research into type. And, you know, it's just like getting into drawing. Like, how do you figure out what your style is? You know, that's a great question, right? And it stumps a lot of students. And a lot of it's like, well, first you just try to draw like the people you like. And a lot of the times you're going to mimic, and it's going to be derivative, and you steal a lot. I know that's weird, but it's like you're going to go like, I like the way this guy does shadows. I like the way this person draws faces. I like, and it becomes like this weird collage of just like other ideas that then kind of, as you get better and better and better, become your own, right?
Yep.
So like it's like that with type. I mean, like you just start looking at like, what type do you like? What do you like about it? Like, you know, you start trying to read it. Because like all art, like, you know, in comics, like one of the big things is like when you're thumbnailing, like you like lay out a panel, and then you go, does that read? Does that make sense? Is that telling the story? You know, if it doesn't, you want to kind of scratch it and work on it over again, you know? So like and there's a lot of practices for that. Like, does the silhouette in this panel read, right? Like if the silhouette's not working, then the pose probably isn't working. So just tricks like that.
Right.
But similarly, like it's the same way with type, where, you know, you just go, can I read this? I mean, that's your first question when working with type, right? Like, can I even read it?
Yep.
Could any of these letters be misinterpreted as different letters? That's a huge one for especially hand lettering. Like a lot of people will hand letter and they get so they almost like miss the forest for the trees, because each letter looks nice, but they don't realize that there are looks like an H or an N, you know? And so somebody is reading a totally different thing, and communication is like number one in graphic design. So you want to go, is it reading? And then you start realizing, like, once again, the significance of all that stuff from type classes. Like, you know, like generally if you're doing all capital letters, they don't read well from a distance, right? So, you know, although there's also traditions in comics of all capital letters, but they're handwritten and they're a little more loose, and for some reason they read better. Yeah. So, you know, you start diving in, and it's like a rabbit hole that gets more and more fascinating the more you do it. But it doesn't really, you aren't, like, if you're interested in type, you aren't going to get very far by being afraid of it. You got to just attack it, and you'll get better as you go. Yeah. And then research it just like you would anything else. So like, I've already found my favorite type houses, you know, my favorite foundries, which, you know, it's a long history. There's a long history. I mean, it's cool too, because you start realizing there's reasons for these terms. Like, you know, like the reason they called uppercase letters was because, right, you know, back in the day, at printers and at foundries, they would keep all the capital letters, all the uppercase letters on the uppercase. It was a physical case, and lowercase was a lower case. And so they have these stacks of cases, and it's like, which letter am I using? Oh, the one on the lower case. That's where it's just shorthand for that. And you start realizing there's this long history, and once again, you also start realizing, like, dude, it's an illustrated form. Like, it's only really in the last like 200 years or 300 years that type has not been illustrated. Yeah. Prior to that, like, it was a drawn form, And
Yeah.
so if you start realizing that, like somebody carved this letter, somebody drew it, somebody used a calligraphy pen to make this letter, then you start seeing the art to it. And I think hand done type is just beautiful, and I'm glad to see it come back as like a trend. I don't know if that's a it's a long topic. I know it's
Yeah.
weird, but I really adore type, and I think especially if you're like newer to this thing, really don't excuse yourself with type any more than you would with a drawing. So if your type's weaker than your drawing, you're doing yourself a disservice, you know?
That's a good point. I think I think I definitely do kind of leave that as kind of a an afterthought sometimes, even though I actually am a fan of hand lettering and type and things like that. But when I'm making my comic, it's especially the more utility, like the stuff that kind of serve just as a utility for reading the book. I don't think too hard about that, but then of course when it comes to the sound effects, that's going to be a little more integrated. But I mean, for people like the people who are most likely watching this are a lot of them are comic artists, and um, you know it's a medium of words and pictures, and often that marriage is very, very underutilized. And it's cool to see examples of people, pushing the boundaries with that more, like with your comic. And, I obviously think of like people like Will Eisner and stuff like that. And I've always been inspired by his stuff and how he kind of incorporates hand lettering and stuff into his illustrations. And I'm sure there's a lot of other examples of that I don't even know, but it's like that's one thing I've done with my. I mean, I've only done finished three mini comics, but I've always tried to incorporate some, do some clever things with type. Like one time I made the title. It's usually like on the title page, but one time I made like the title of the book, like it was written in the wrought iron fence or whatever that was in the background and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
another one, it was kind of like a graffiti thing because my character was a graffiti artist and stuff. So, and that's another thing with for me, like I've always been interested in how words and letters are formed, and because being a hip hop artist and being so much into the whole culture of hip hop, obviously graffiti is a big part of that too. And for many years, I mostly focused on my music and didn't really mess with art too much. But when I did mess with art, it was always like kind of this graffiti style stuff. So I kind of have a lot of practice with that. I won't say that I ever really necessarily got super good at it, but it was something I was definitely always playing around with in my sketchbook and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And graffiti, like, it's funny because like a lot of, like when so I taught like at LCAD, and like a lot of the classes I started teaching, I ended up teaching senior level classes, which were a lot of fun because you have like these artists who are like really like trained and ready to go, and you can give them really advanced projects.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I noticed with like newer students in like the foundation classes, like intro to like one was like just intro to Photoshop, and like they'd come in and they would have like a graffiti style, but it wasn't what you were talking about where it sounds more informed and stuff. But they'd have like a style where it was still illegible and weird and kind of off. And they would be like, well, but it's graffiti style. Or another common one was like, well, I'm just a manga artist, like, and what I found was like, like a lot of those students would have like bad teachers who were just like, manga sucks or graffiti sucks, so just do the right thing.
Yep.
But what they needed was actually, because to be honest, like a lot of them weren't doing strong graffiti or strong manga. So what you really needed to do, what I loved to do, was like, okay, here is Mike Giant. Like that was one of my favorites for graffiti artists, where I'm just like, here's Mike Giant, look at his type. And it would blow their minds, because this guy is like one of the biggest graffiti artists ever. Now he has like some personal views that I don't necessarily agree with. Like I think sometimes he gets tied in with like the skinhead movement or something, which is
Oh,
frightening.
really? Wow.
But he's also one of the most influential like graffiti artists alive. So it's like, you know, especially for the San Francisco, like, you know, Northern California style of graffiti. And so like if you turn somebody on to something like that and you show them like what it could be and how it's like you can still read it and it still has intent and meaning, or if they want to do illegible type, you show them some metal records and you're like, this is the way to do illegible type, because even though it's illegible, it's like insanely awesome looking, you know?
Yeah.
And you try to gear them in a direction that's still kind of going back to those basics, because there's still foundations in that. There's letter form. A lot of traditional and classic graffiti and even contemporary graffiti, without knowing it, is influenced by, you know, a long history of calligraphy. And so there's an art to the way that the artist is arcing, you know, their letters. There's a certain amount where, you know, even at its purest, where they're, you know, bombing it on the side of a wall or something, there's an art to like how much paint you're letting out, where you let your drips fall, and so like it, when done right, it is beautiful. And so like I would always encourage my students, like if you're gonna dip into that realm, you better compete with the big boys, you know? Like if you're gonna dip into graffiti, you gotta compete with the big guys, because like there are graffiti artists and then there's guys just tagging. And to me, there's a huge difference. You know, because like when I was in high school, we used to bomb trains, you know, not bomb, but like bomb, you know.
Yeah, right.
Because like there was a train station near our high school, and it's like, you know, but like I wasn't doing art on those trains. I was just saying like a bad word or something, you know, like there's a difference between writing and lettering, and like and the cool thing is it's from any angle. So and that ties into manga artists too, where it's like, you know, there's this template that a lot of students come into school with that's like the wrong template. And I think one of my teachers, I've said this on like podcasts, and I don't know if I've said this on video yet, but one of my favorite teachers in school, I remember her talking to a manga artist who like everybody in the class kind of acknowledged was not a strong artist. They were just using a template over and over again. Every character looked the same, you know, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. Usually it's kind of like, it looks like Sailor Moon over and over again. And then the guys look like Sailor Moon, but with like, you know, long dark hair. And there's one guy with long blonde hair and glasses that somehow obscure his eyes. And there's like a million glints on the eye. And there's no chin, right? So it's just, and like, and I remember my teacher talking to them and going, you know, like this is your third assignment that you've turned in on the same template. And she said, I really like Charles Schultz a lot, and I like Snoopy. And Snoopy's drawn with a specific template. So if I went to art school and, you know, I got like a project to draw like an editorial for like a fake article or something, and I turned in a drawing of Snoopy, do you think it would be appropriate for the for the teacher to be like, yeah, that's great? No, because that's Charles Schultz's template, not yours. You know, you need to find your own template for a dog, you know, because Snoopy looks like Snoopy and he's a certain template, and that's one of the big issues with manga. It's not, and not manga, I mean manga, you know, like student manga. Because there's a strong divide between that and like if I pull up like Akira, the graphic novel, or you know, you start getting people into Ghibli films and stuff. It's like there's a massive divide between that and student manga, you know. And the divide is like really authorial intent, you know. Anyhow, rambling, but yeah, I found that like really helpful to kind of get my mind around that. And similarly, like I said, like letter form is like you should, like I said, you gotta attack type just like you're attacking a portrait, you know. And if you're not into it, it's gonna read. So like just like it would if you were drawing something. It's that weird unspoken thing about art where if you're not engaged and interested in what you're drawing, like it's gonna come across like boring, you know? Like
Yeah.
it's that weird thing where you're just like, man, or you know, like in hip hop, it's totally like that. Like, have you ever heard just like a bored MC? It's the worst. You
Yeah.
know, like where they're just running through the motions because they're like, I hate this gig. You
Ugh.
know, like it's boring. You gotta have an MC who's engaged. You
Mhm.
know, like I'll take an engaged MC who just sucks, you know, over like a bored MC who's got skill, because
Yeah.
like you can kind of feel that energy,
Yep.
and it's the same thing like with type. So often because we like, I mean, we got into drawing for a reason because we like drawing stuff, you know, and a lot of us, like for me, I like drawing people, and I used to hate drawing buildings, you know, like to
Yeah.
me it was always that. And so I always had a weakness with buildings, and I had to find a way to like drawing buildings, like find things about them that I liked. Because before that, every building I drew was just boring, you know?
Mhm.
And it's the same with type. It's like you got to find, like you were saying with your covers, you know, like how can you make this relate to this story? How can you make it more fun? How can
Yeah.
you push it a little bit so that you're interested? Because if you're not interested, why would you expect anybody else to be interested when they look at it? You know, I don't
Right.
know. But that's my own thing. And by you, I mean more like me back when I struggled with type. You know,
Right.
I find that I think my biggest problem was I was bored with my own type. So why would I expect somebody else not to be bored with it? You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now I
And
try to challenge myself, like almost every other page at least, to try to do something interesting or different with my type because it keeps me interested. Because otherwise, I'd get bored to death. You know?
yeah, and I mean that's the thing, like especially with comics, is it's so there's so much opportunity that people don't use, and you know, that's one of the awesome things that makes comics its own thing, you know, and
Yeah,
it makes comics just awesome for being comics, and you can't really replicate it in a movie or something like that. Certain things,
for
and
sure.
the type is one of those things. Like what recently in the Lizard Brain comic I'm making, like there was a scene where the bully guy or whatever is throwing dodgeball. They're playing dodgeball, and he's throwing it at these people, and like in between each like scene of one of the kids getting hit, you know, it's like the sound effects like bong, ping, whatever. But it's like it's part of the divider of the panels or whatever, and it the letters look like, you know, kind of a dodgeball, like they're rounded and they look like they
Nice.
could bang off of somebody's head or whatever. So it's like it's so fun to find those little opportunities, and it helps you with your layout. And you know, I get compliments sometimes, you know, it's like, oh, that's a really, you know, interesting way that you laid out that page. And it's like, well, you know, if you are just going to approach comics and be like, okay, here's 9 squares, fill them and go to the next page, put your 9 squares in there and fill them. That's one way to do it. Kirby did
Yeah,
it and he's amazing. But like, you know, that's one thing that I take away. Like a lot of people will criticize, you know, the 90s and, you know, you know, Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, all the image guys. But one thing that they did do was they weren't afraid to just go nuts with the panels. And,
yeah,
you know, maybe sometimes they probably went too far, but, you know, that's one thing I take away. I'm like, that was one of the awesome things that I loved about 90s comics. So I'm going to
yeah.
put that into my comic.
Well, I think you're right, and like I've seen that page, and the type is really cool. And I think there's a few things that you touched on that I think are really important. One is like the broad vocabulary of comics. So like you have so many design challenges with comics, and I'm of the theory, and I'm a little biased because I love comics, but I'm of the theory that part of why I love comics and I stick with them, even though there's a low profit margin and it's a lot of work for a little result. Like
Yeah,
I mean, like, you know, I'm on page 46 and I'm a couple years into this, you know,
there's
and like,
really no good reason for a sane artist to make comics, but we love it and it's awesome.
yeah, but there are some interesting reasons, which is that it for me as a graphic designer, I mean, I do graphic design every single day, And prior to that, I had like 15 years of just doing every kind of illustration you can imagine. And maybe not so well, but regardless, I did it professionally. And like, I faced a lot of weird challenges and crazy deadlines, like Wired magazine going, we need an editorial half page tomorrow on, you know, this video game you've never played, because I don't video game. I haven't owned a system since Nintendo, you know, so I have to research video games and blah, blah, blah. Point being, like, you get these weird challenges and you start attacking them, and that's half the interest of art, right? Is like, how do I do this? Like that, right. And how do I solve this problem? It's problem solving.
Yep.
And the interesting thing to me about comics is it's the biggest problem I've ever faced as an artist. It, like, once you get type down, then you have sequencing, and once you have sequencing down, then you have splitting your narratives, and then you have panel shapes, and then when you have panel shapes, you have what happens if I, you know, start playing with movement, like the idea of sequential movement. How can I slow and speed time effectively? Because you can do anything with time, and it's interesting because you're forced to come up with your own limitations, and then also to challenge and push those limitations all the time. And because it's type and image, hopefully seamlessly integrated, it's an eternal challenge. And so to me, like, that's one of the things that engages me and makes me really fascinated with comics is, like, I don't quite have it figured out. And when I've read it, the masters talk about it, they don't really have it figured out either. They've figured out a ton, but they still see all this endless potential in what it could be.
And I think that's one of the biggest things is the potential. Like, even if you do get a certain way that you do it and you master that, now you can go a whole different direction and do it totally different, you know, and explore and experiment, you know.
And then, like, what's fascinating to me is, like, and this is only a recent development too, like maybe the last 10 years or something, because I grew up, you know, reading superhero comics. I followed Spider-Man, like, and I'm one of the weird people. I used to collect Web of Spider-Man, which is like the least valued of the Spider-Man, but that was my series, you know. I loved it. And so a lot of John Romita Jr. and stuff. And then, like, and similarly, like, I got into the image stuff, and I was like, wow, this is mind-blowing. And then as I've gotten older, I start digging back further, like even beyond, like, Golden Age. Like, you know, a lot of people are like, okay, let's start with Golden Age comics, you know, because there was some beautiful work in there. But even before that, like in newspaper strips, and this is an interesting area of the history of comics to really look into, is like the early 1900s, where they were kind of inventing this thing, and there were no rules. Like, it was just like, you know, like, if you, like, I mentioned Winsor McKay in an older vlog. You guys should check him out if you haven't checked him out. But what's interesting is you look at, like, his paneling, and the type's really hard to read. Like, they were figuring it out. They didn't know what to do with panels and with words. And this is beautiful work, but the type, like, in the word bubbles, is really hard to read. Like, it squeezes all the way to the edges of the bubbles. It breaks all the rules, you know?
Right.
But there's other stuff at the time, and even paneling that they were doing back then, like particularly George Harriman with Crazy Cat, where he was defying the grid before there was a grid. And I mean, he was just playing all over the page. And so much so that when, what's his name? Calvin and Hobbes, I'm blanking out.
Oh, yeah.
Bill Watterson.
Bill Watterson, yeah.
So when Bill Watterson was like, I think he was like a couple years into Calvin and Hobbes, and he stumbled upon Crazy Cat. And I mean, this is talking about stumbling upon stuff from like 1920. And he was like, pretty much like, what have I been doing? Like, because he had been doing the grid. And right after that, like, immediately you see these, I mean, people always compliment Watterson for breaking the grid and doing these really inventive things with like a half page. And that didn't come from nowhere. That came from like him looking at the guys who made the rules
Yep.
and we're breaking them before the rules were even made. It's a lot like, you know, if you're going to get into hip hop, you got to look into the roots of hip hop, you know?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time, like for me, my favorite hip hop is like the era of like A Tribe Called Quest and Far Side and like Wu-Tang Clan's like 36 Chambers and like a lot of the points where they were inventing a sound, you know, or a style. Oh, did you freeze?
Do you see me or hear me?
Yes, I hear you, but I think your image froze.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I was I figured I'd Google Crazy Cat because I'm like jealous of these people when they're doing their podcasts and they're like, oh yeah, you should check out this, and then they like type it in and they're like, oh yeah, that is really awesome, and so I'm like, okay, I can do that now, and then my computer doesn't want to be nice today, so
Oh, it's okay.
I'm not gonna do that anymore,
No,
obviously.
no worries, man. Yeah, like so Crazy Cat is something to check out, but and it'll blow your mind a little bit. And like the cool thing is it influenced more than just comics too. So I guess like Salvador Dali like got a lot of influence from George Harriman's
Oh,
background.
really?
You probably hear my toddler in the background and
Yeah, that's okay. That's cool.
But yeah, so like
I've heard I feel like George Harriman because I don't know if it was the Bill Watterson documentary or what, but I definitely saw some stuff about like the early history of comics, and George Harriman, is he the one who did like he would do like it was that somebody did like this, it would be like a full page, like one of them that's famous is like this beach scene and there's like tons of little panels, but it's all like one picture and things are happening in each panel.
that's Frank King.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's Gasoline Alley. So that's another thing to check out is Gasoline Alley, where so like around the same era, you had this guy doing Gasoline Alley, and then he did another series called Walton Skeezix that was based on Gasoline Alley. And I think Duran and Corley puts out collections, which are really good at those. I could go on and on about the guy, but like yeah, so like one of the things he does that'll blow your mind, like so Harriman is known for like he did stuff like making the whole page itself a design. That's what Harriman was really known for, and then for his dialogue and stuff, and also because like Walt Disney kind of ripped him off to make Mickey Mouse. So like those are some things he's pretty well known for. I take him very seriously. That's him.
Nice. Nice.
But he made Crazy Cat and Ignatz. So there's an award in comics called the Ignatz Award, and it's based off of Harriman. But Frank King did other like, so this is why I love looking back. And the cool thing is you don't need to know it all. So I want to clarify that for anybody who's watching too. Like if you don't know George Harriman, don't feel bad. Check it out. You know.
Yeah.
But Frank King, he did, and I've done some stuff, like I have a print on my Society 6 shop, which you can find like through my regular website, like my portfolio site called joshuakemble.com. But I did a panel where it was people walking through a park, and each panel they're aging. So it's like it starts when they're children meeting in the park, and then you watch the park actually progress and go through different seasons. But as a whole, it's like a big poster. And as a whole, it's a big city scene of Central Park. And that was super influenced by that exact panel you're talking about, the Frank King, where Frank King would do these panels where it was like a city scene and it's these kids running throughout the city, but the whole thing acts as one picture and separate moments in time at the same time. And he did the same thing with like a tree that was like it was in its infancy, and then it grows throughout the panels, and then the whole thing is this giant scene where the tree grew. And it's stuff that the more you get into comics, the more you start seeing the brilliance of it, you know?
If you need to jet for a sec, feel free.
No, it's cool. My wife's got it, but
okay.
Yeah, he's probably upset about a toy. That's my guess.
Yeah.
Tends to be the case.
How old is he?
He's 3. So
3. Okay, yeah, I have two nephews, and one just turned 4. The other one I think is 6, and I've seen all these phases. They're definitely fun and interesting and challenging.
Oh yeah, three is the most challenging and the most fun so far that I've experienced. But three is like the age of like, you know, they start feeling a lot of independence, so they are really eager to kind of get their way,
Yeah,
and not so eager to basically be parented, which is like, you know, you gotta like sometimes they just have to nap and they don't even know it, you know.
yeah, yeah.
And so it's like this negotiation that's relatively new. Everybody says terrible twos, but for just being challenged, like three, I think is much worse.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's funny because you said that on the Artcasters recently, and I was like right on because that's I remember my nephews, both of them, like they were so like I was like, okay, they're 2 year olds now, they're gonna be terrors, and they were so sweet for their whole 2 year olds, and then three hit, and it was like they got possessed by something, and
Oh yeah, no, I mean you know, not often. There was one day this year so far where it was like it felt like yeah, it felt like a horror movie, like just like there was just this evil, and it was like, what happened to you? You were cute, and now you're
yeah,
like crazy. Um, but like you know that, but like you know to tie it into our discussion before too, it's like the parenting thing is a lot like comics too, where it's like you know okay that well wow okay now I've tackled this and I've figured this out, but now there's this new thing, the type thing, and
mm,
I got to figure that out because how do I do that? I don't know. I've never done it. So you
mm,
have to attack it and figure it out. And it's the same thing with like you know being a parent. Like there's all this stuff. Like every time, like you know, you're figuring out you know like what do I do with this like diaper thing,
yeah,
and then you're figuring out like okay now what do I do like now that we're out of the bassinet stage? How do we do this whole crib thing and on and on and on. And every time you have a challenge down, there's a new one.
yep,
And it's interesting because while you're facing these challenges, you yourself are kind of growing and figuring it out, and you get a lot better at it. You know, like the first time, you know, your kid hits that manipulative stage, it's like I fell for it the first few times. You know, I was like, oh, like he's sincerely upset, and then what happens is like you know you have a kid who doesn't nap, and they're even more upset because they didn't nap. And so like you start going, oh, they don't even know what they
yeah.
need, you know? And I'm the parent, I know. So it's a challenge and it's constantly interesting, you know, but like it to me, like all of life is full of like these weird, interesting possibilities for growth, you know? I don't
Absolutely.
know.
Yeah, no, it does. It actually does make sense that it is analogous to comics because it's the same thing. Well, obviously, it's harder to probably bring up a kid, but it is like it's like you're thrown all these challenges, and it's like you're just thrown all these like eggs or something, and you got to find a way to catch them all and not break them, and it's just that's how it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I think he wants in here because he was just saying open. So I think he's wanting in the door.
Right.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's no problem.
So anyhow, yeah, so like that's a challenge too, like with you know, juggling, right? Because like I do vlogs,
Mhm.
and so like you know, like trying to find a window to like record a vlog. Like some of my vlogs I've just recorded with Benji sitting on my lap and just you know talking through stuff because he you know as a kid he wants to be engaged and constantly near you, you know,
Yep.
and so like finding that window of time to even do that is really interesting. But what to me is the most interesting thing with parenting, as weird as it is, not that this is a parenting vlog or anything, but it's like how much time you have becomes really clear. And
Mm,
so I actually think you become more effective at time management because before being a parent, I really felt like I never had any time. And then you have a kid and you really don't have a lot of
yep.
time because you have limited time to kind of do anything. And
Yep.
so it makes you value time a little more, but you know that's not to say people who don't have kids don't value time. It's just interesting how it changes your perspective of time because now like thinking back to like pre having a kid, I'm like what was I doing like half the time, You know, I was
Yeah.
watching all these movies and stuff, and like felt like I didn't have time, but it made time to do this thing. You know, like
Yeah.
it's interesting how it makes you reassess, like, you know, but regardless, anyhow, that's just a little rant. But
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. Time management can be a tricky thing for all different situations. I guess I also just and we can start moving towards the end here soon. I'm sure you
yeah,
need to get back and stuff. But we one thing I wanted to talk about too a little bit was the whole concept of doing an autobiography, type of comic and stuff, and just like, I don't know, just your thoughts on that, and your influences, what made you want to kind of go that route with this huge kind of endeavor, which you're about halfway done with.
huh? Autobio. It's funny because I did this book before called Jacob's Apartment, and it was a really good learning experience. It was my first like full graphic novel, and I
Hmm.
think it ended at like 126 pages, full color. And I had a publishing deal like throughout the majority of the time I was working on it, and then the publisher dropped it like after it was finished. It was like a
Oh,
heartbreaking experience.
that's crazy.
Um, but I learned a lot because like before I did it, for one thing, like my first comic that I had ever done was like a little, I think 24-page comic called Numb, and I got like the Zarek grant for it, which was really encouraging. And I was just like, man, this is insane. This is the first one I finished. That's
Mm.
not the first comic. It's just the first legit comic that I had actually seen from start to finish. And it was autobiographical because that was my interest. That's what got me into comics. Was like, um, I was really inspired by guys like Harvey Pekar and Art Spiegelman and Robert Crumb, and you know, a lot of the work by Will Eisner that kind of started to trend towards autobiography. And I just felt like this is a really beautiful thing, and I love autobiography just as a format when it's done right. And then for some reason, I got convinced when I was doing Jacob's Apartment that like you can't do autobiography because you're too close to it. So you have to fake it, and you kind of have to change names out and change characters and change situations. So you're crafting a story. And then when I went back to school, because I had dropped out of graduate school for a little bit because I just thought it was BS for a little bit. And then I changed my mind very quickly because I realized like the opportunity to work on like your own project and have mentors like pushing you to grow, to do what you want to do, is actually a kind of rare experience. And some people don't need graduate school to do that, but it helped me immensely because I remember I was plotting out, like I knew I wanted to work on comics. I was plotting out all of this stuff, and then I was being pushed towards like painting and towards all sorts of different like media and stuff. And finally it got to the point where you know, and I think this is the intent of a lot of grad school, is like I just got to the point where I was like, no, I see really vividly and clearly what I became an artist for in the first place. Number one was like, I, I had colored Jacob's Apartment because I thought, I should do a comic in color because that would look cool. But I wasn't thinking about my own personal preferences with comics. I like black and white comics. Like that's my favorite artwork to look at is black and white. There's this artist named Jason Lutz who's doing this comic called Berlin, and at the time he was putting out these stories, and they're these beautiful black and white panels, and I don't think they'd be any stronger with color. I think they'd be worse.
Hmm.
And so like I basically took that and realized like, you know, and Jeff Smith, like Bone, I don't like the color version. I mean, I think it's nice, the Scholastic ones, but when I got into Bone, like I was buying the cartoon books Bone, you know, that was like self-published, it was put out, and like it was these beautiful just like ink lines, and I like seeing that. So I was like, why do I feel like important questions like why do I feel the need to make this in color? Like if I had my way, how would I approach a comic? If like a millionaire came to me and was like, "Hey, you can make anything you want," would I do it in color? And I wouldn't. I actually like working in black and white. I prefer it. And so I was like, okay, so I don't want to do color. I want to do black and white. And I also realized I want to do stories that are true, because I think there's a lot of power and beauty in truth. And so so that's kind of where Quarterly Stories started, was me sitting down and going, well, what do I like? Like I love the book Blankets by Craig Thompson a lot too. And I was like, I like stories that have a semblance of truth to them. I feel like I have a story to tell, and I don't want it to be black and white, and I don't want to work to size, because I almost worked to size on Jacob's Apartment, and I was like, I felt really restrained by that. And I want to make every page the best page I can make, because I feel like I've been copying out on pages. And that was just a little sit down with myself that I had to do, where I was like, I feel like I've been copying out on pages. I haven't been making pages the best I can. I haven't been showing off all my skills as an artist on my pages. So I need to up my game on my typography, because my typography on my graphic novel prior to that was all digital. And I was like, when I read comics, I really like hand lettering. There's something about it, something about the little imperfections and stuff. Right. So I wanted it to be hand lettered. And I just went through this list of like, what do I want from a comic as a consumer? Like, what do I want? And then I was like, well, isn't that what I want to make? You know? So so I just tackled it. Like, I was like, okay. And the story is also, I think, you know, like, I also feel led to tell autobiographical stories. So I mean, it's a story about how I became a Christian, and to me that was really interesting. And what led to that was interesting, and so, like, because I had interest in it too, I was thinking, you know, I could make this story. The other thing was, like, there's a lack of people talking about mental illness and like depression, and like my wife for a long time suffered from panic disorder, so she'd have these debilitating panic attacks. And what was interesting and depressing going through those things is, like, there's not a lot of people who are really candid about that stuff. Like even friends who've gone through it are just like, I don't want to hear it, or cheer up, you know, or like fix it. And then in the Christian community, I found that even more common. Like, well, you're not trusting God, you know, that kind of thing. And which is weird, because like I rarely meet like a Christian who, like, if you have cancer, is against you seeking treatment, you know. Like, that's a problem. So, like, if there's medicine that can help you, you might want to take that medicine. But not that approach to, like, the mind. And so, like, to me, I really wanted to write a story that talks really openly about, like, depression and thoughts of suicide and panic disorder and those little uncomfortable things in the world that like not everybody wants to talk about, but I suspect are actually a lot more common than people realize. Yeah. And so I think by presenting that, you're kind of making people realize they're not alone, and I think that's a really important thing. So so that's one reason. Sorry, long-winded question.
No, that's all right.
And then one of the final reasons that I decided to kind of work in the format and write autobiography is that I find it challenging to, as a writer, I always feel like if there's a territory you're uncomfortable about, that might be a good indicator that that's where you should head. And so for me, the process of writing this has been really uncomfortable. Like, I've been sharing things in it that I do not like sharing, that I don't feel fully comfortable or good about. Like, so I'm heading into a chapter right now where, you know, as a character, I'm kind of an asshole, you know, and you know, this is where I think one has to be careful writing autobiography, because I think we've all read, like, you know, blogs or vlogs where somebody's like, well, I was a jerk, but this is why, and this is why I was justified to be that way, and you're on my side because I'm the main character and this is my movie.
Right,
That
right.
kind of thing tends to read as like really boring, you know, at least to me, because it's like, first off, it's not very authentic. Because to me, what I know of myself is like, I am not always the right guy in the story. If I have a story, I'm not always behaving the way I should, and my justifications don't always actually back up my actions. Like sometimes I am an asshole, you know. And to me, I'd rather read a story like there's a movie, and it's actually a book too by Nick Hornby called High Fidelity. And I think it's a really powerful book and a very powerful movie. And it's not autobiographical, but it has that feel because it's got authenticity. And I think one of the points in the movie that really sold me on it was there's a point where the main character pretty much confesses to funding an abortion and then ditching his wife. Like, I mean, it's like and like ditching his wife like right after that, and I think borrowing money from her after that too. So it's like it's just like he's confessing to something like most people wouldn't even talk about or whatever,
Right.
and just very openly, like pretty much telling the reader. I think there's a point where he tells the reader, like, you are not going to like me. Like, this is not, you know, I am not the good guy in this story. And I think that there was something about that that actually made it feel true. And it's kind of this weird, complicated thing about truth because it's so hard to define. But for me, like that was the territory I wanted to go into. So when I'm writing this, I'm trying to be really conscious that there are readers and that I am the last person I should trust to depict truth in my own life. So where I like to go with it is, if there's even a truth about myself that feels uncomfortable, I want to dive into that. And if I'm going to exaggerate anything, I want to exaggerate that. Like, where was I not so great? You know, and so like that's kind of where I'm heading, but it's really uncomfortable to write because, like I said, that leads to territories where it's like, you know, I may not look so good, and you know, if someone takes this too seriously, like maybe they think that's who I am now, and you know, that could have a dire impact on me. But at the same time, I think it'll make for an interesting story. So I don't know if does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You know, I was gonna say, like, you know, I definitely commend you on that. That's, you know, a courageous approach to creating, you know, a comic book, and you know, it's definitely one that I don't know if I'll ever be at or not, but at the moment I'm at right now, that's not the direction I would ever
Yeah,
take my stuff, because it's not necessarily, and I think it really takes like a certain, almost like a calling or something, because like it's just not what I'm interested in writing. I am interested in reading the story,
yeah,
but it's it just it's certain, it's a certain approach that that I think is kind of really special, and it does make sense that it's not done very well very often, because it is a very courageous approach to creating a story. So
yeah. And I
definitely
mean,
commend.
I think it also does delve into, like, you risk coming across as extremely narcissistic, and
Mm,
so you know, that to me is something I'm very aware of, and I'm very much trying to avoid. And we'll see if I'm effective at it. I mean,
mm,
the last thing I want to do is like preach to a choir that, you know, to make them think I'm this great person. You know, what I'm aiming to do is tell a good story that reflects truth, and we'll see. And I think in a weird way, you're saying you're not heading to that realm, but I think any story at its core, whether it's fiction or, you know, even if it's fun, like it's like a Pixar movie or something, you know, it's like, I think there needs to be that little underpinning of truth,
mm,
you know. I think that's what makes Star Wars so awesome. Is
Yeah, I
there,
absolutely agree because like I think it is like when I say I'm not heading in that direction, like I feel like I am like I do want to tell truth
yeah,
in a story. I do want to show honesty, you
yeah,
know. I think that is very important to any story, and to not hide from the things like you know before we were uh, doing the recording, we were talking about how kind of the Bible is like that. You know, that the Bible doesn't hide the faults of its characters, um, and it's the same thing. Like any good story, you know, you gotta show the good and the bad, and you have to tell the truth, or else it just it won't register with most people.
yeah. Agreed. And like, so to me, I don't really view like what I'm working on as all that different, except that there's less of a market,
Yeah.
you know, but like it,
Well, it's kind of easier to do that if you like that. That's kind of for me, like not that I have anything I need like crazy thing in my life or whatever, but I like fiction in that I can kind of hide behind characters, you know.
yeah,
I kind of like that aspect of it. And maybe one day I will feel moved to do something that's more from from my actual life. I don't know, but yeah, it's just interesting those two different approaches really.
yeah. And it's funny because like I read a ton of fiction and I'm a fantasy and sci-fi geek. Like I love children's cartoons, like if
Mhm.
they're done well. Like one of my favorite realms of art is like animation and classic animation, not just indie. In fact, I prefer a lot of traditional animation over indie animation, which is, you know, I like the, you know, the Walking Dead comics. I like, you know, a
Mhm.
lot of like, you know, very mainstream like superhero stuff. I love like I'll be the first in line for a lot of superhero movies, you know. So I don't think there's not a place for those things. So why I choose autobio is just because I think that's what I'm wired to do.
Mhm.
Which reminds me of this weird thing about artists is like I think a lot of artists who are like really detailed are really envious of artists that are really loose. I think a lot of artists that are really loose are envious of the artists who are really detailed. I think a lot of it's just like this weird thing where it's like, you know, maybe you're good at hip hop, but you like rock and roll. Maybe you're good at rock
Mhm.
and roll, but you like hip hop. You know,
Right.
maybe, you know, you're good at classical music, but when you get home, you know, you're turning on like, you know, whatever. So the point being like, you know, we all have a variety of tastes. And I just feel like my voice as an artist, at least at this point in time, is mostly with that nonfiction realm.
Mhm.
And I mean that could change. I love fiction. I think fiction can be more challenging sometimes because you know one advantage of auto bio is it's a lot of it's editing.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you need to be. I think there's a responsibility when you're doing auto bio correctly. And this is my own view to be really fair with that editing
Mhm.
because a lot of the times you're talking about other people. And so that also runs the risk of like you don't want to libel people.
Yep.
You don't want to misrepresent truth. You don't want to manipulate people
Mhm.
unless maybe you're writing propaganda, and that's not what I'm aiming to do. So, you know, there comes a slight responsibility with it, but it's more of the responsibility of like a journalist in a weird way. Like you know, you're kind of doing journalism and you're trying to make it interesting. Um, but you know, with fiction, you're having to invent a lot. And I think there's auto bio in fiction, a lot of it, because you know you want to pull from truth in life, but you still have to kind of create the story. And so in a weird way, it's like both times you're concerned about story, but you know there is an easier element to auto bio in the sense of like if I have a story I want to tell, as long as I'm focused on what that story is, the nice thing is there are events that happened, and if I edit out the extraneous stuff that doesn't serve the story, then you know I've got a story.
Yeah.
Whereas you got to start from the ground up with fiction, and that can be more challenging. And then how do you take like a story like for me like Star Wars is really complex because how do you take a story about space, you know, samurais and make it interesting and believable?
Yeah.
You know, like that's like how do you make like the unbelievable believable?
Yeah.
And that to me is like that's really cool. That's really awesome.
Yeah, and I think
And
that is like I enjoy that challenge because even right now, like I'm writing my thing for the Life and Space the 100s anthology, and it's kind of fun because obviously the new Star Wars movie just came out, and I had 2 weeks off, so I was like watching all the Star Wars movies, so I'm like in that zone, and it's like, okay, now I'm gonna get to make a space comic, so this is like my chance to like just put all my fun things on a comic or whatever. And so I have these, like three characters and stuff. That's kind of the main part of it. And so now I have to find like the theme of it. Like what am I actually, like, what is the story actually about?
yeah,
They can do all kinds of fun Indiana Jones type of things, but if it's not actually like about something, which is that's the part that would come from life and come from experience and telling the truth and being honest, if it doesn't have some element of that in there, then it might be fun, but it's not gonna, I personally like stories that have some kind of theme or that element in there, and
yeah,
you know it gives it substance that I think is very important, at least in stuff I want to make.
yeah. So I know we're getting like towards the end, and I do have a toddler to get to at some
Right.
point. But I did want to like I've gone this whole time, and I wanted to ask you about the hundreds. Like, how is that going with the editing? I know it's weird, but like I've had a few friends that edit anthologies, and it is no easy task. And so I was kind of curious how that's going, and I'm not sure how much you can share, but I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's at very early stages, and Mike Emirates and Chris McQuinlan have really done a real good job with kind of setting it up, and we have like the way we approached it was, we discussed well, first of all, we did like these polls and stuff in the group or whatever, and we got everybody's opinion what they want to do and stuff, and then we pretty much used that as our basis of, all right, now we're going to kind of create like a template. This is how it's going to go, and there's a certain format. Everybody's story is going to be in a certain specific page layout or whatever. They're all the same, and
Yeah,
so there's like we kind of made this I don't even know what to call it, but it's just like this write up or whatever of basically all the rules, kind of, which were agreed upon really by everybody. But we just kind of like you're saying with your story, it's more editing. Like we took all the stuff and now we just cut things out till it makes sense. So there's a structure to it. So it really, I mean, there's not. I don't think it's gonna be. It's not like the stories are connected and stuff. So I don't know that there's gonna be a ton of work for us to edit. We just got to keep an eye on what people are doing and try to make sure they stay within the loose parameters.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to be too much heavy lifting. I could be wrong. It's like I said, it's in the very beginning stages, so everybody's still just starting out. We
Did
did actually run into an issue. Actually, this, I don't know, last night or today or whatever, with like format, but I'm sure that'll be worked out.
Yeah, I mean issues will crop up, but like, did so you said like everybody kind of agreed on this. Have you had people who agreed on it go back on their agreement?
Well, that's one thing. I feel like it's funny because in our discussions, Chris and Mike, I mean, they've really done a lot of the work. But I feel like what my my kind of role has been is like bringing up questions, that are like, okay, but just let's realize that this, and this could go wrong, and
Nice. So
probably,
you're foreseeing like eventual problems,
yeah,
which is
like
good.
probably this will go wrong. Like
Yeah,
the idea of like, okay, we got like 20 people or whatever, and I told him, I'm like, because I've actually done some projects sort of like this, and I'm like, that, it's very possible that only 15 of the 20 people could finish, or what happens if we get to the end and, people are not finishing their thing or whatever,
Yeah.
and just like questions like that. So we have foreseen some of those things. Like I said, I did a it's funny because you guys were talking about the mini comic stump truck, and I was a part of the final one that he did with Art and Story. That's where I actually made my first comic, and then my second mini comic was made by basically a mini comic stump truck that myself and another guy, Ryan Wheaton, created a few years back. And
Ryan's a good dude.
yeah, Ryan's cool, and like those though, like the people who did the mini comic soundtrack with Art and Story, a lot of those people were the same people who did it with us. Um, so that was my second comic, was made through that. So when we did that project, we ran into those kind of issues like that Kevin was talking about in the last podcast with you
Yeah.
guys. So I think it'll all work out to a certain degree. I mean, the thing is people who don't end up pulling their end, that just won't end up being part of it, I think, is what's going to end up happening,
Yeah.
And I think we'll still have plenty of content,
Yeah, I mean, I think you're gonna end up with a good book. I was just curious because, like, I've noticed, like, with leading people in general, it's just like it's always surprising. It was, at least for me, some of the earlier stuff that surprised me was how you could have everybody on board with something. In fact, even like make something happen that someone specifically asked to happen, and then that same person who asked for it will quite frequently be the person who's the least happy with it when it actually happens, which
Yeah.
to me was really mystifying until I had talked to like a mentor of mine who gave me the tip. They were just basically saying like, hey, look, anytime you introduce change of any kind, like positive, negative, whatever, people go through a grieving process. And all the stages of grieving are there. And so like for me, like at least when I'm managing, like I run across that all the time where new paint on the walls or something simple like that. Like, hey, we need new paint in our department. Like the paint is old. And then you have everybody pick a paint color and you make that happen. And they're like, I don't like the paint color. Like it's just, it's an inevitable eventuality of groups of people. And it's worse in certain groups than it is in others. But like I said, a lot of editors I've talked to butt heads with that quite frequently, where it's like you get the whole group on board with an anthology, and then inevitably, like there's dissatisfaction with whatever the parameters are that everybody agreed on, and frequently from the person who recommended part of the parameters. So I was just kind of curious about that because, like, it's always fascinating, like that happens, and I think it takes a little bit of resilience to get through a big project like that. So I'm impressed that I mean, A, that you guys are doing it. B, like the roster you have looks really cool. So I think it's going to be a good book, and C, like you guys are going to troop through it. Like that is an exercise. Like that's quite a shock. So like if you guys are in the hundreds, like you guys should be thankful to the people who I'll just say, be thankful to the people who are going to be pulling the heavy weight of editing it, because it sounds a lot easier than it is. I think. So not to like, but yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate that absolutely, and obviously from you have experience with some things, so like you can see that, and it is. I think that's the problem you were saying is that's kind of where leadership does come in handy, and that's also like when I mean, we didn't decide that we were going to be the leaders, they did, so that's one thing. And then also, I'm really happy that it's Mike and Chris because they have a reputation with getting things done, so I know that they're not going to just let this fall by the wayside and kind of peter out,
Oh, of course.
So that's kind of where I'm basing, some of my confidence and stuff, and yeah.
Yeah, you guys are gonna rock. And like I do think it's a good team. So and like I said, the artists involved, it's gonna be really cool to see. So I'm looking forward to that. I think.
Yeah, it
Has,
should be interesting.
has anybody already finished?
Not yet, surprisingly. I think if Holly were to just be focused on this, she'd probably be done by now because she's already inking pages and stuff. And it's like we've only been at this for like 2 weeks or whatever.
Yeah, she's incredibly fast. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of mind blowing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's inspiring to watch her vlogs and see what she produces for sure.
Oh, for sure. Cool. Well, dude, thank you so much for having me on this. It's been fun. It's been fun talking shop. It was fun talking shop before recording. It was good.
Absolutely. I'm glad we were able to do this. We did go a little bit long, but we kind of started a little late, and we got into a little more discussion on the front end. But yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you came on. I've been wanting to talk to you, and it's really cool, and it's really cool too because. It's funny because the last person who I had on this show was Jersey Jost, and I plan on getting Kevin as well. We've talked about it, and it's just funny because I guess I'll just say it, like I was very much seriously planning to be like, okay, once, because I'm at like 96, this is the 96th episode. I was like, once it hits 100, Escape Artist is done. And so it was like this full circle of all the people who inspired me with their podcasts back in the day. It's like, oh, I get to have like them on now, and it's like a full circle thing. But I have made a decision to continue with it. So so that's
Nice.
not exactly going to happen, but it is really cool to be able to revisit some of those people who inspired me, with the podcast. So thank you again for coming on.
Awesome. Yeah, like I honestly I think just getting in dialogue with other artists like Marshall, I watch your channel all the time. It's really to me it's always just inspiring to watch people making stuff and like
Mm,
challenging themselves to grow and it's interesting to me because like a lot of what your channel is about is not just like growing as an artist but just growing as a person. So like you've got this interesting like crazy coding thing you're doing, and one thing I like seeing is that you're always doing, and that's like those are the kind of people I like to follow and get inspired by and stuff. So it was a blast to be on this, and it's always cool to build community. So I like the little YouTube community we got going, and I'm glad to kind of finally have made an entry into it. And I'll be looking forward to watching your interview with Kevin too. Kevin's rad, so it'll be good to see. Um, yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that the community, that it's become a community, because I've been on YouTube for a long time, and I always wanted an art community to start going. And I think it really, when Jeff Lafferty started doing stuff and collaborating with people, it started to build, and that it's really cool. Now it's actually becoming a cool like community. So yeah, I agree with you on that.
cool.
So yeah, just again, thank you, and please, let everybody know again where they can find you before we sign off.
Sounds good. Well, you can find me right here at Marshall's channel on this on this interview. You can also find me just by looking up Joshua Kemble on YouTube, or you can also look up Poly Nothing, which is my username, and you can check out my old portfolio work at joshuakemble.com. And the most important website to me right now, since it's like my baby, it's my big personal project that I do my vlog about and pretty much everything else about, is quarterlystories.com. And I just released a poster on there of the ABC poster. So if you go to that website, you like what I'm doing, consider getting a poster so that it can kind of help fund some of this extra stuff. But yeah, and then like just stay engaged and keep making stuff because it's really cool, and I do pay attention to like what's going on, and it's cool to see. So yeah.
Absolutely. And also, everybody, don't forget that you can see Josh probably every week on the Artcasters talking
Yeah, that's
about
true.
this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's true. The recent development. So I just joined the Artcasters with my good friend Kevin and Scott Cirkland and Jeff Lafferty, who, if you guys have been watching Artcasters, I for some reason had this mental block on his last name, and so I have finally gotten it down. But he's really kind of the founder of that thing, and it's cool. It's like a little hangout where we all do art and talk about the business, and sometimes we'll just shoot the shit about, just our days and stuff. But it's a really cool podcast. Before I was even on it, it was just fun to listen to and work on. So I'll work on art too. So yeah, it's been really cool.
Absolutely. Cool. So all those links will be in the show notes. And again, you guys know where you can find my stuff, donkeyjawprojects.com and Donkey Jaw Projects pretty much everywhere. So thank you everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on the Escape Artist Podcast.